By the time I was in my late 20s, I got the itch to say, I really want to try to do something on my own. I didn't really know what that was, so I started just kind of talking to folks in our community, came across Everyday Technologies.
I want to really focus this episode on the front end, the job shop front end. When you got there, when you said, all right, you got the keys, what was the process from initial quote to that release to the floor?
In terms of the aspects of the business, this is the one that I play in the most.
Welcome to the Next-Gen Metal Fab podcast. I'm your host, Tim Heston. In each episode, I'll be joined by a rotation of co-hosts, Caleb Chamberlain from Oshkosh, Cody Lee from Everyday Technologies, and Lance Thrakill from All Metals Fabricating. Together, we'll talk about what the future could look like for precision sheet metal and tube fabrication.
Summer's just around the corner, and that means it's camp season at SparkForce. These aren't your average summer camps. SparkForce camps give young people hands-on experience in manufacturing and skilled trades. Think welding, design, engineering, and fabrication, all in a fun, high-tech environment. Campers don't just learn new skills, they expand their minds and explore exciting career paths. Want to get involved or bring a camp to your community? Head to sparkforcefoundation.com to learn more. And now, back to the episode.
Thanks so much for joining us for the Next-Gen Metal Fab podcast. I'm joined today by Cody Lee of Everyday Technologies. This time we're just going to do a one-on-one, just to kind of do a deep dive into his operation, and he'll review how he got into the fab business initially. But I believe, Cody, you are the youngest of our cadre of co-hosts in this podcast. How old are you?
I am 33.
Kind of bring me through, again, just a quick review, because I just got you by yourself, a review of how you got in the business to begin with.
Yeah, I guess the long story short is I don't come from a manufacturing background. I don't have a family that, it's a generational business or anything like that. The closest ties that I do have to manufacturing, I would say, would be through my father-in-law. He owned a fresh cut produce business that he started back in the late 80s with his brother. And they grew that from $0 to when they sold in 2016, I think they were doing 140 million plus in revenue. So basically their process was their raw material would be, romaine lettuce, onions, carrots, all that stuff that are grown out in the field, whether it's in California, Arizona, Oregon, Michigan, whatever it is. And then they would ship that into their facility that's here in Sydney where I'm located. And then they would, cut it, clean it, package it, and ship it out to their end customers, who would be like Panera Bread, different restaurants like that. And that's kind of how they grew their business over 30 years or so. So he's kind of what got me turned on into the business world, manufacturing, all that stuff. So kind of fast forward to I graduated college from the University of Cincinnati in 2014. My wife and I settled in, bought a house, all that stuff. Shortly after, got married, had our first kid, did the whole thing. Worked at a couple different places. I got my marketing degree at the University of Cincinnati. So first job was a marketing manager for a sportswear apparel company actually located out here in Sydney. So I did that for several years. And then after that, went and worked as a business development rep for a general contractor that's located out of here in Sydney. And so really got exposed. Their bread and butter was doing, building additions, renovations, things like that for different industrial customers. So a lot manufacturing. So kind of got exposed to it from that front. And then by the time I was in my late 20s, I got the itch to say, I really want to try to do something on my own. And I didn't really know what that was or what that would look like. So I started just kind of talking to folks in our community. And again, to make a long story short, came across Everyday Technologies and got in touch with the owners there. It was owned by two brothers who had owned it for a little over 20 years. And Everyday's been around since 1928. So it's passed through at least two or three other owners over time. And got engaged with them, put a letter of intent together, went through the diligence process. And in August of 2021, I'm the owner of Everyday Technologies. Again, that's the long story short.
And I know there's a longer story behind that, but just want to really focus this episode on the front end, the job shop front end. So when you got there, when you said, all right, you got the keys to everyday technologies. What was the process from initial quote to that release to the floor? What was, if you could draw a map, kind of give me a verbal map of that process.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, this is, I guess, in terms of the aspects of the business, this is the one that I play in the most. So, tend to be most passionate about it, and definitely we've had a lot of evolution in regards to that process since I got here. So, kind of the state of the state whenever I joined every day, you know, they'd obviously been around for a while, had pretty, you know, a lot of systems, a lot of different processes that had been around for a long time as it relates to onboarding new work, quoting, things like that. The only major software piece of technology they had at the time was a very antiquated ERP system. Um, it had been around. I think they'd had it for 20 plus years at that point, and basically what it did was a very basic job tracking system. So they would quote. I think they might have quoted inside of it, but maybe not. A lot of it was like napkin sketch quoting, so to speak. There may have been some kind of module in there, but nothing sophisticated. Maybe enough to get some material costs, and then you could, of course, build a router inside there. And then they had work center rates. So you'd say X amount of time for laser form weld, whatever it be. And then once the job was awarded, basically all that existed from quote to building it into our system at the time was just a job router. There was no bill of materials. There was no standard times. It was just, step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 ship. And so that allowed us to, get work to the floor, have a system that allowed us to track the job. But outside of that, that was pretty much it. There was virtually zero transparency in a quote that allowed anybody who was estimating to understand what your material cost was, what your labor cost, overhead, any markups, and then obviously what your overall margin was on the part. None of that was obvious or really known. I don't know the rhyme or the reason, but the ownership before me, basically their quoting structure or philosophy was they had work center rates, so they charged X a dollar an hour for laser time. But I guess baked into each one of those was not just costs, but also the margin. So you can imagine you'd quote a part and you'd quote a laser form paint part. It comes out to $25. Nobody could come back to me and say, we're quoting this at X% margin. It was all just kind of baked in. So it was very convoluted, very misunderstood. So that was kind of what we started with. So I wanted to transform all of that. And that's really what we've done in the last couple of years.
So what were the first steps in transforming that?
Well, after being here for several months and kind of taking a step back and understanding what needed addressed first, right, from an investment standpoint, first and foremost, the things that they were doing worked, although not very well. They weren't very scalable, but we addressed equipment first. So we got, a laser, new paint line, some other things. But from the technology standpoint, the first step that we actually took was implementing a new ERP system. So graduating from what we had for many, many years to a system that we use today called Plex. And it's pretty well-known ERP system in our industry. But, of course, there's several others. And really the reason that we started there was any information that we wanted to be able to derive from a quote needed somewhere to live after you've awarded the job. And up until then, that didn't exist. You had no bill of materials. Inventory management was non-existent. It was spreadsheets and tribal knowledge. So getting that set up was kind of step one. And I think we took that on in, I want to say it would have been 2.5 years ago, roughly 2 years ago. At least when we went live. The process of starting to going live took about 9 months. Part of that reason was because we manage hundreds of parts for our customers. And so if you think about a part, specifically an assembly or a weldment, it's coming from several individual components, right, that are ultimately welded together or whatever it is. Each one of those are its own part. And so we had to create those parts, recreate them inside of our new ERP system, define the bill of materials, weight of the part, any hardware, etc. Give all that stuff names and homes inside of the ERP system, come up with the standards. I wish I could say we time study every single part, but we kind of took a best guess at a lot of it because the information was non-existent. So, I mean, building that from an engineering standpoint took many, many months. But that was kind of step one, and we went live with that. And I think June, uh, I think it was June of 23, so about 2 years ago.
So you mentioned best guess on time studies. Kind of, did you group like, all right, these are the, did you do it by part profile, part thickness, number of bends, how much welding? What were kind of the rough part families that you kind of put together to say, all right, this is how long it's going to take roughly?
I mean, we do a variety of different parts here, everything from laser-only parts to complex weldments, and then they vary in terms of, I guess, quantities we make a year, right? There's parts that on any given day you walk out there in the plant, you'll see it because it's just a higher volume part, and then there's parts that get manufactured once a year. We tend to try to stay away from those parts, but just with the legacy customers that we have, the life cycle of that part at one point was probably higher, but nonetheless, the customer orders it 3 times a year still. So what we focused is we took our sales data that we had from the previous year and just kind of categorized stuff from what are we making the most of down to what do we make not the most of. So with the parts, I would say the top third of that, we really kind of dove into, how long does this part take to weld? What's the laser time on this? Unless it's kind of a weird part, you can generally apply, some sort of standard rule for X seconds of bend for a formed part, etc. So that's kind of how we approached it there.
All right. Did you incorporate a setup time or, how did that work
Yeah.
for you?
Yep. Setup times and run times for all the different operations. Setup times were mainly just a standard that we would apply, no different than how we quote today.
Okay. Okay. All right. So what, you got the base rough line, then what was the next step as far as streamlining?
So when I think about the front end of our business, obviously you've got the sales function of it, right? Soliciting and finding work, whether it be with new or existing customers, quoting that work, and then once you get awarded that work, we go through what we call an APQP process, which is basically just we get a team of our folks together to review a part package or whatever it is that we had been recently awarded and go through any risks and different things and identify different standards or things that we want to apply to the part before we release it to manufacturing. So that process happens, and then we program the parts, of course. So creating the flats, applying bend deductions, programming for our press brakes, etc. There's that portion of it, and then there's kind of the FAI or the PPAP process of proving that part out. And then once that's completed and signed off by ourselves and our customer, then it's into production. So everything I just said right there is what I would call front end. And of course, you've got order entry and all the other things that go along with that. So kind of in parallel through the Plex journey, I really wanted to make quoting, I guess, more standardized and more transparent. So the first step I took there was actually through an Excel, like a homegrown Excel format. And we had several iterations of that. I mean, I came across our very first attempt at that a couple weeks ago and just how rudimentary it was compared to what we ultimately got to with the Excel spreadsheet. And then especially today where we utilize paperless parts for all of our quoting. But that was kind of the first step there. It basically just kind of broke everything out, your material cost, a way to kind of come up with a weight of the part to get your material or your steel cost. It had some tables behind the scenes that would do some lookups to be able to pull in different steel costs and materials and different things like that. So that was kind of what we did in parallel with Plex, and that lasted for us for quite a while. And quite frankly, it worked pretty well, we thought. And then, from there, we kind of graduated into the paperless parts quoting software, which we went live with that, I want to say, late last year.
So back up with that did you have any data cleanup issues? So like, so I've visited some shops, so they have like, stainless 304 is SS 304, or it could be stainless 304 or 304 SS in the data. And so you have all these little, inconsistent key-ins that has happened over the decades. I'm wondering if you've had that, or was the data pretty clean?
In regards to Plex, the ERP, you mean? or
In
those.
regards to your raw data, like say material or job identification
Yeah.
standards, standard way you identify parts, identify jobs, identify identify your, file trees, all that kind of stuff.
Right. So it was kind of a hybrid. So of course, some of those kind of general nomenclatures for how we identified materials and different things inside of our business, there was something that existed prior. Um, Naming material was one of those things. So we kind of had a standardized version of that. So for example, if you've got a 16 gauge hot rolled or cold rolled 48 by 120 sheet of steel inside of our system today, and what we just kind of copied from before was it would say 16 space capital T for thickness, and then it would say space 48 120 CRS. So in some cases we had to redo that, but in other cases we just kind of kept the same flow. But one thing we did do for all of our hardware and weld nuts, PEM nuts, all the things like that, we gave it its own what we call an EV number for every day. So for example, if there's a standard weld nut that we buy from a Mastercard, it'll be ED-0001-0022 or something like that. So we had to give those. We came up with those, basically a spreadsheet that kind of generated those numbers for us, and then those kind of became the standards inside both of our quoting software and our ERP system.
Okay. So you had a pretty standardized data. It wasn't a mess, so to speak. It was there was some standardization to your data entry for prior to you getting there. So
Yes, but the only
yeah,
difference being is like before, I guess the analogy is it was just handwritten everywhere, or now we're actually digitizing and making that.
that's right. That's a handwritten.
Yeah.
So you mentioned PPAP and first article. So how do you squeeze that into production and schedule that? So no, as far as first time you run a job, etc.
Uh, well, that's actually something we're trying to improve and beef up right now. So we've been fortunate this year. We've been had the opportunity with several customers, some new, some existing, where we've been quoting a lot more, and most recently getting awarded that work. And one of the challenges with any manufacturer, specifically in sheet metal, we've had this conversation before in your guys' podcast, but um, kind of what I would define as the two differences in the type of sheet metal fabricator you can be. Generally speaking, you either exist in the job shop world or you exist in what we call contract manufacturing. And then there's a few out there that have mastered both. But for us, it's really hard to dip in both worlds, and kind of how that plays into, I'll say, the PPAP world is you've got this, you walk on our plant, you've got parts that have been flowing through there for years, or, everything's standardized. The folks are familiar with it. There's work instruction, process instructions, all that stuff that exists for those parts, and they tend to go through fairly smooth. And then you've got this new part that you've been awarded that also needs to get out on time and have high quality, but no one's seen it before. We're proving it out, and it's got to go through the same work center, so to speak, to get to, shipping at the end of the day. And it's really tough to demand of a production team to say, hey, we need you to make sure that you're taking care of our current customers and getting production out the door, and also keep an eye on this job that you've never seen that's got some nuance to it we're trying to prove out. So that's definitely a struggle. So we historically have had an engineering team that consists of quality, programmers, and our estimators and quoting team. And the way we try to approach it is kind of trying to isolate that work versus production. So rather than telling our production supervisor on the floor he's got to worry about this PPAP order, we make that the responsibility of the engineering team. So we try to segregate that. And we actually just made 2 recent hires that will be starting here in the next week or so that will be complementing that team, because the more work you get awarded, the more parts that you have to manage through engineering, programming, PPAP, the harder that gets to, be watched by 1 or 2 people, right?
Right. How do you fit it in between your larger jobs? Is it just sequenced, or is due date, or is it just, or do you have a time where, well, this time is going to be for this PPAP and new orders that we're not as familiar with, so we're going to offer, a little bit extra wiggle room in the schedule for these kind of things.
So I mean, in one sense, it kind of bleeds into the other work that exists out there. A couple of the main differences is whenever we release a job router to the floor, one of the standard processes or system that we have out there is if it's a white router, that means it's a proved out part, it's production, it flows through the shop. If it's a purple router, that means it's an FAI or a PPAP. And there's only certain folks out on the floor that are qualified to our standards to be able to run those jobs, to take the dimensions and check the tolerances and all that stuff, alongside of our engineering team. So, you could go out to the floor to our press brake department where we've got, 8 press brakes, and you might see 6 of them running a white router, and one of them is at, one of our more senior press brake operators, and he's running the purple job, right?
Right.
From a scheduling standpoint, we have a lady here that does all of our scheduling and creates all of our jobs. And basically, Plex, our ERP system, backwards schedules everything. So, for the due dates, 3 weeks from now, it says, hey, we've got some predetermined times for each of these work centers, plus the standard rate that was quoted into it. And it just kind of backwards and says, you need to start laser cutting on this date so that I can go to the next step to be able to ship by this date. That's sort of how we manage it.
Gotcha. And then how do you track the costs for those, say, PPAPs, where you go through, it's like, all right, it's a new job, PPAP, FSI, whatever it is, a new job. And then, all right, here's how much it costs. Here's the price. Is that priced accordingly and competitively for what we're doing, and kind of feedback that information?
Yeah, so I'll answer that on 2 fronts. One, I'd say, is from a material variance standpoint, and other from a labor standpoint. The material standpoint, what's really nice about paperless is it syncs with our ERP system, Plex. So one of the things I failed to mention that was very difficult for us for a while whenever we went live with Plex is, okay, now you've got this great system that can take in all this information, but you've got to give it the information, right? So what would happen is we would quote a part in our homegrown spreadsheet where you're basically defining the processes and the standard times, right, and the bill of materials. You get awarded that part. Well, now someone's got to build that into Plex. So you're basically redoing all that. That became basically a full-time job for somebody. And so with paperless now, we get awarded a job. You basically hit a button and it syncs right into Plex, the bill of materials standards, all that stuff. And so with, as we're selecting, hey, this is a 7-gauge grade 50 material, it syncs with Plex by the hour and is pulling that cost in so that we always have live costs from that standpoint. So from a material standpoint, whether it be the PEM nut or the sheet steel itself, that's always pretty accurate. From a labor variance standpoint, I wish we did better at that. Generally speaking, we do a really good job with our laser time, right? Because our paperless has a nesting module in there or some background integration that basically tells you the laser time, right? Using the same tech table sequencing that you would get from like Boost or something like that. So from a laser standpoint, from a press brake standpoint, it's pretty accurate. Where things can start to get a little bit offline is really just in weld or in some cases assembly, right? So really the feedback loop that we get is people out on the floor saying, this took us 8 hours to do this weldment. And now that everybody has visibility into paperless, they're saying you guys quoted it with 4. So that's our white flag to be able to say, hey, customer, we missed something here. We don't do that often. In some cases, if you miss it, you kind of just take it on the chin because there's a larger scope of work that's being had there. But if it's something where it's like a big project or a big part and you're like, we're going to be running a lot of these, we missed this dramatically, we have a pretty good feedback loop between our engineering and production team.
Right. But at least now you have that transparency as far instead of just a general number of, hey, here's the rate. And, you're not talking, you have a transparency of this is the actual labor time that we're predicting for this weld. But it didn't take that long. It takes this long. And that feeds back into your software. So the next time you quote something similar, you've got, geometrically speaking, it says, all right, then then you've got that down. What's interesting is I just had an email conversation back and forth with another fab shop. He's an FMA member, and he was talking about time-based prototype work. So in other words, he wants to basically shut his shop down for about 1 or 2 hours for designated times during the month or week or however much prototype work there is, and then do purely time-based work. So per hour. So like, all right, we've got this prototype job. We'll be honest, we have no idea. We haven't done this before. And it's and to quote this accurately is kind of quixotic, to be honest. It's like, my gosh, it's going to be low volume, and in fact, we could actually spend time prototyping to do some DFM work for you. And in the old school days that's what we used to prototype, and that's why you prototyped is, hey, you could manufacture this better if you did this or that. And so they just literally bill by they want to know, they're trying to bill by the hour like a lawyer, basically, and say, all right, we're going to do this for low volume work, for low quantity prototype work. And then that grows into a very strategic quote that can scale with the customer. That's the dream anyway.
All we're doing is selling time. And so it's how you value that time and what value proposition that gives to your customer. And so
Right.
if you got someone who's willing to have that kind of relationship with you and buy that dedicated time for prototype work, then all the power
Well,
to you.
it's kind of similar. I've seen similar arrangements with, say, powder coating. Let's say there's some shops out there I know that has large shops or large OEMs that have predictable um, needs for powder coating. They just rent the line for 2 hours every week, and they could use the whole line for the entire 2 hours, or they may just use 1 hour, but they have to pay for 2 hours. But they have that capacity; it's guaranteed capacity for that time,
Yeah.
and it's well worth it. And it's much less than buying a huge powder coat line. So that's kind of how that works.
Yeah.
It's interesting, but it's great now that you've got this foundation of data to start, and now that's kind of gonna streamline things further. And it almost do you think it's having an impact on how folks operate on the floor as far as this new way of doing things in the front office? Kind of a where you've got, all right, now it's a lot more streamlined, a lot more scientific, and now you've got numbers to prove it. And now that you have, separate those jobs out, you almost have a career path for folks to take, saying, hey, if you get qualified, you can do this PPAP work and move up the chain and actually do the purple packet stuff.
Yeah, the purple packet stuff, that's been something that every day for a long time. So, and that's certainly a way to sort of graduate yourself through the production floor in terms of, you know, certainly pay, but responsibility, capabilities, all that stuff. What's been interesting is just with the technology that we've introduced into everyday technologies, with the quoting, the programming software that we use today, ERP system, and all that stuff. It's not only created new positions, it's quite frankly, it's gotten rid of some. I mean, we used to have at one point 3 or 3.5 order entry people, but now we have ways to automate that. Now we're down to one. The other day I was talking to her, and she does other things. She says order entry is probably 10% of her day, and so I mean that's a huge change. But we've had a material handling girl that's been out on the floor with us for probably 4 or 5 years, and she kind of played the water spotter role where she would move pallets, work to different work centers and kit things together and all that stuff. Where now she's literally helping or assisting our purchasing manager by managing a portion of MRP, material resource planning, for all the different hardware and things that we generally kit with, because she has that visibility at her computer now like we've never had before. And it's telling her when she's going to run out of stuff, what her current stock is, who to buy it from, all that stuff. And that's given her an opportunity to grow and expand the business. And there's countless examples like that that's evolved, from I guess, a result of us introducing this technology.
That's huge. That's huge. It gives people another kind of career, and also kind of melds the business. You no longer have front office and shop floor. It's basically just flow. And it's
Right.
basically, hey, I mean, no longer are you going to be a hardware operator, just, hey, here's the hardware and I'm going to operate the insertion press. It's, hey, is this the right hardware? Does the hardware work? Is this the right hardware for the job? I'm the one that sees it every day. And so you get
Right.
that communication right at right out at the shop floor. And what I felt interesting too is got and we'll be writing about this, but I went to a presentation. This was at a paperless event of actually with One Factory. If you ever heard of One Factory, but it automates the quality aspect of it so that no more data entry in the QA department. You just click it and it feeds automatically to other software, so you don't have to yeah, fat finger mistake in quality is still a thing,
Yeah.
so to
I've
speak.
not heard of that.
Yeah, where you connect. How do you integrate your quality as far as who does quality on the floor versus QA personnel, etc.?
Yeah. So on the floor, there's kind of two respects there. So we build quality control into each one of our parts that go out. So generally, we have what we call like an internal quality manager who handles all of our PPAP submissions and documentation and all the things required from our customer. He's also making the internal calls on things that get flagged out on the floor from production from a quality standpoint. But the operators are required for every single job that goes to the floor at every step to fill out some basic information of that part to be able to advance it to the next step, whether that's filling out, some, the quality manager has put in some key tolerances for certain dimensions or features into the part that they are responsible for filling out. And if it's outside that tolerance level, then the part gets flagged, so to speak, and can't advance to the next step. So there's little things like that are required on the shop floor by the operators. And then, of course, kind of a step above that's from a PPAP and documentation standpoint, it's done by our internal quality person.
Right. And so you're no longer having, QA, you can't inspect quality into a part. That's the old saying, right? So so you have in-process quality control, but then how do you define the parts where operators need to check versus the QA personnel at the end of the process needs to check as far as a certain sample out the door, whether it be every 10 pieces, et cetera.
Yeah. I mean, we have a boundary sample process like you're alluding to, where, every 10 parts or 50 parts, whatever it may be, is checked by the operator. As far as what gets inspected above beyond that, we have an inspection table where we have a on-floor inspection person that every job has to go through. They're not checking every single piece, but they are checking different lot sizes to ensure that, basically the part, even if the operators put in the information, is making sure that that's true, at least for some portion of that work. So that happens all the time. And of course, if it's a PPAP or FAI new job, then that's done by the person I was talking about before, who's has to document all that stuff anyways because our customers require it. Whether it be a level 1 or a level 4 PPAP submission, depends on the amount of information he gets. But we also have a hexagon CMM arm that can both do the probe and the 3D scanning. So that information is documented and sent with our PPAP submissions as well.
Does that information directly go to another platform, or do you still have to do some keying in as far as that's concerned?
Definitely some key in it. It doesn't sync into any existing software that we have today. Generally speaking, some of our larger OEMs, they have a PPAP submission document. It's basically an Excel sheet that they require you to fill in. For customers that aren't that sophisticated, we have our own internal process that we do for, general, I guess, we'll send out a bubble print with these different dimensions on it and stuff like that. So no technology that we have today. Plex does have a quality module that we've not, I guess, opened that door yet, but I'm sure eventually we'll get there.
That's interesting. It's a trend that's happening where I'm talking to more shop managers who say every time I see a keystroke, that's something I want to try to eliminate. And instead of having it a keystroke, you have a information quality inspection. So instead of keying in, you just make sure that whatever was the keying in that was automated is correct, and so that there's a as one guy called it, the information sanity check, so that you don't have because I've seen rework happen these days. Everything happens so quickly. You have rework that happens these days for no reason because somebody misplaced a decimal point, and it was actually within tolerance. But no, you reworked it because somebody somebody hit the wrong key.
Right.
And so if we can get that information, and that's where, I mean, that's why I heard talk at recent conferences I've been to of AI and robotic process automation and all this kind of stuff that's really going to change. And especially if we can get better at reading PDFs and other documents that are protected from a competitive standpoint, because they want to, the customers want to keep that wall. They don't want too much, integration. And so a small fab shop has to deal with, all right, I have to deal with this paperwork here, that the fact that and these drawings and these bubble drawings, and they're not 3D files or anything like that. And so it's an interesting conundrum that's going to have an interesting future.
It is, yeah, and it always blows me away. I mean, we deal with almost strictly OEMs of various sizes, but they all seem to be pretty big. And how different from one customer to another is, both have what seem like endless amount of resources, right? Huge engineering teams, quality teams, supplier quality people, all that stuff. And customer A always sends you a 3D model, a print, all the necessary information to put together an accurate quote and, a detailed part. And then customer B sends you a print that's basically faded and no additional information and expects you to turn a quote around really quick. And it's just like, I don't know why you guys do this to us, because the ease of business, you guys want quotes fast and accurate. And all we ask in return is just good information. And you guys have the capability to do it, I would think.
Yeah.
But some customers value that more than others, apparently.
Well, it's a matter of, as more shops, serve the better information customers better, the market will actually, promote that, saying, "Listen, you need that better information." At the same time, you've got software automation that's actually, turning bad information into better information, so it can read these drawings. We're not there yet, but we're every time every time I talk to folks, and especially in the software field, and especially with AI and software development, and things that Caleb has said on this podcast. It's like, in the future, I can see, like, for instance, if there's going to be a next generation of everyday technologies, you're going to have people in the office who are going to be writing software.
Oh, yeah.
Or yeah, they're gonna be, and at that point, writing software will be much different than it is today. It's gonna be a lot more intuitive. It's gonna be they're gonna be writing custom processes to manage the information flow through the factory. And I think that's what's interesting, is that every time we think about automation, we think of, okay, well, humanoid robots are gonna be carrying things around on the factory floor. And it
Yeah.
may happen in some areas. I know that, Boston Dynamics and a few others have amazing robots out there that are actually working at Amazon warehouses, and they're making it happen. But I think the greater potential is to have that information flow just absolutely seamless on the front end, even at the smallest of companies in this business. And I think that day is not too far off. So yeah, so as I mentioned, it really is going to be a different world. I think, not only within the next generation, but I think even within the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to see some really fantastic stuff, especially from the software end, and AI and robotic process automation and everything else. So, Cody, thank you so much for joining us for this edition of the Next-Gen Metal Fab podcast, and we'll see you next time.
The Next-Gen Metal Fab podcast is a production of Fabricators and Manufacturers Association and part of the FMA Podcast Network. The show is hosted by Tim Heston and Caleb Chamberlain. The podcast is produced and edited by Garrett Slager and Dana Weicker. Additional production support by Dan Davis, Andy Flando, Mike Owens, Billy Culpa, Elizabeth Gavin, and me, Sarah Spring. Thank you for listening.
We'll be honest, we have no idea. We haven't done this before.